So you want to break medieval law. You have this picture already, and it is a good one. Stone courtrooms, stern judges in heavy robes, a system that punishes murderers and thieves with appropriate severity, while decent, law-abiding people go about their business unmolested. Maybe you imagine it was harsh, sure, but harsh in the way that makes sense. Serious crimes earning serious consequences. The problem is, that picture is almost entirely wrong. Medieval law could end your life for offenses so trivial they would not even earn you a fine in most modern countries. Wearing the wrong fabric could destroy you. Charging too much for bread could destroy you. Saying the wrong thing about the wrong saint on the wrong afternoon could put you in front of a crowd that had already decided how your story ends before you opened your mouth. The legal system you are about to walk through tonight was not a blunt instrument applied to obvious criminals. It was an elaborate, sprawling web of rules so specific, so locally varied, and so unevenly enforced that almost anyone could find themselves tangled in it on any given day, and the punishment waiting at the other end was rarely what anyone today would call proportional. Before we settle in, like and subscribe if you enjoy these, and drop a comment letting me know where you are tuning in from tonight. I always love seeing where these stories end up. Now, dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft background hum, get yourself comfortable, and let your shoulders finally drop away from your ears. Tonight is a long one, so just settle in, let the screen do its thing, and we will take it from here. Could picking up sticks from the wrong patch of forest get you hanged? Was there a law that made it illegal to pretend to be a different social class? Did medieval courts actually let you prove your innocence by grabbing a red-hot iron bar? Could your entire family be punished for something only you did? Was there a real crime called forestalling that could ruin your life for buying groceries at the wrong time? Did the church run its own separate legal system with its own separate death sentences? Were there laws regulating exactly how sad you were allowed to look at a funeral? Could a pig be put on trial, given a lawyer, and formally executed? Congratulations, you have just woken up in 1312, somewhere in England, with a thin blanket, a mild headache, and absolutely no idea how many laws you have already broken just by existing in the wrong shirt. Let us walk through the ways this world could kill you for almost nothing. The first thing you need to understand about the law here is that there is no the law here, not in the way you are used to thinking about it. You carry this assumption with you from the modern world, a perfectly reasonable one, that somewhere there exists a single body of rules written down in a single place, administered by a single system, and applied equally to everyone standing inside its borders. That is not what you have walked into. What you have walked into is a tangle, a dense, overlapping, frequently contradictory mess of customs, royal decrees, local traditions, church rulings, manorial regulations, guild bylaws, forest codes, and borough charters, all of them claiming authority over you, and none of them particularly interested in whether the others agree. You are standing on a street in a market town, and the law that applies to you right now depends on whose ground you are standing on. Take 3 steps to the left, and you might cross from the jurisdiction of the Lord who holds the manor to the jurisdiction of the church that owns the land the church is built on. Walk through the market gate, and you are subject to the borough charter, which has its own rules about trading, pricing, weights, and measures that may have nothing to do with the customs observed on the manor you just walked away from. Step outside the town walls and head toward the trees, and you have entered the royal forest, which operates under an entirely separate legal system with its own courts, its own officers, and its own punishments that answer to the crown and to nobody else. You have not crossed a national border. You have walked 100 yards, and the rules have changed 3 times. This is the comfortable lie about medieval justice that most people carry around without ever examining it. You assume there was a system, a rough one, certainly, a harsh one, absolutely, but a system with a basic internal logic that a reasonable person could follow. Know the rules, obey the rules, avoid the punishment. Simple enough. The problem is that nobody knew all the rules. because nobody could know all the rules. They were not collected in a single document. They were not posted on a wall. Most of them were not written down at all. They lived in local memory, in the minds of the men who ran the courts, in customs that had been practiced so long that everyone just assumed they were binding, even though nobody could point to the moment they became official. A rule might exist because a lord's grandfather had once declared it in a fit of irritation about wandering livestock, and 60 years later it was still being enforced by a steward who had never thought to question where it came from. The closest thing most people had to a legal education was watching what happened to the last person who got caught doing something wrong and quietly adjusting their own behavior accordingly. Think of it this way. You live in a modern city, and you already deal with overlapping rules you have never fully read. Federal law, state law, county ordinances, city codes, your landlord's lease agreement, your employer's code of conduct that somehow applies to what you do on your personal social media account at 10 o'clock at night, the homeowners association that has opinions about the color of your mailbox and the height of your fence and whether your holiday decorations stayed up 3 days too long, the parking regulations that change depending on which side of the street you parked on and what day of the week it is. You navigate all of these simultaneously, and most of the time, you do not think about it because the penalties for getting it wrong are small. A parking ticket, a sternly worded email from the HOA, an awkward conversation with human resources. Now remove the internet, remove printed books, remove public signage, remove any mechanism for ordinary people to look up what the rules actually say, and then make the penalty for guessing wrong not a fine or a sternly worded letter, but public humiliation, physical punishment, the confiscation of everything you own, or death. That is closer to what you are navigating tonight. The real architecture of medieval law was jurisdictional. Everything depended on who had authority over the space you occupied, and those authorities stacked on top of each other like geological layers, each one deposited by a different era, a different power, a different set of concerns. At the top, at least in theory, sat the king and his royal courts, which handled serious crimes like murder, robbery, and arson, along with matters of land tenure, disputes between powerful men, and anything the crown decided was its business. The royal courts sent itinerant justices out on circuits through the countryside, arriving in each region at intervals to hear cases that had accumulated since the last visit, which meant that for much of the year, the king's law was not physically present in most of the country. It arrived, held court, passed judgment, collected its fees, and left. Between visits, justice was whatever the local powers said it was. Below the royal system, the local lord ran his manorial court, which dealt with the daily disputes and petty offenses of the people living on his land. These courts met regularly, every few weeks in most places, and they handled everything from accusations of small theft to arguments about field boundaries to complaints about whose pigs had been rooting in whose garden to questions about who owed what labor and when, what counted as a crime, what counted as an acceptable excuse, and what counted as an appropriate punishment depended entirely on the lord or his steward. Two manors, separated by a single hedgerow, could operate under completely different rules, applied with completely different levels of severity, because the law at this level was not a universal standard applied impartially. It was the lord's personal prerogative, shaped by his temperament, his financial needs, his mood on any given morning, and the customs of his particular holding. There was no appeals process that an ordinary tenant could realistically use, no higher standard against which his decisions could be measured. The Lord was the law, and the law was whatever the Lord said it was that day. You could live your entire life on one manor, learn its rhythms, understand its unwritten expectations, navigate its particular version of right and wrong with reasonable confidence, and then your Lord dies. His son inherits. The new Lord has a new steward, with different priorities, different irritations, different ideas about what matters. Things that were tolerated for decades suddenly become offenses. Practices that everyone relied on are suddenly forbidden. The rules have changed overnight, and nobody sent you a memo, because the memo does not exist. You simply wake up one morning and discover that what you did yesterday, without consequence, is now something you can be dragged to court for today. Alongside both of these secular systems ran the ecclesiastical courts, the legal apparatus of the church, which claimed jurisdiction over a strikingly broad range of human behavior. Matters of faith and doctrine, obviously, marriage and divorce, and the complicated question of which unions were valid in the eyes of God, wills and inheritance of personal property, tithes and church revenues, but also blasphemy, heresy, perjury, sexual morality, failure to attend services with appropriate regularity, failure to observe feast days and fasts with visible devotion, defamation of a specifically moral character, and anything touching the conduct of clergy. The Church's definition of its own jurisdiction was not modest. If a dispute touched the soul, the sacraments, or the moral standing of anyone involved, the Church argued it belonged in a church court, tried by church law, under church authority, using procedures and punishments that had nothing to do with the legal traditions of the kingdom the court happened to be sitting inside. The beautiful thing about this arrangement, if you enjoy dark comedy, is that these three systems overlapped constantly and disagreed regularly about who owned which piece of your life. A single act could be a crime in one court and perfectly legal in another. A single accusation could drag you before a manorial court for an offense that the royal court considered beneath its dignity, or before an ecclesiastical court for a sin that secular law did not recognize as a crime at all. You could find yourself answering for the same action in two different courts simultaneously, each one claiming sole authority, and each one entirely indifferent to the other's opinion. The Constitutions of Clarendon in 1164 were Henry II's famous attempt to draw clear lines between royal and church jurisdiction, particularly the explosive question of whether clergymen accused of serious crimes should face royal justice or be tried exclusively in church courts. The argument that followed between Henry and Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, escalated from a legal dispute into a bitter personal confrontation that consumed both men for years. It ended with 4 of the king's knights riding to Canterbury Cathedral and murdering Becket on the stone floor of his own church while he was at vespers. The murder shocked Christendom, turned Becket into a saint, and forced Henry into humiliating public penance. And the jurisdictional question it was supposed to resolve remained unsettled for centuries afterward, which tells you roughly how well jurisdictional disputes were resolved in this period. And then there was benefit of clergy. This single legal principle reveals more about how medieval justice actually worked than almost any other rule in the system. The idea was straightforward. Anyone who could demonstrate membership in the clergy could demand to be tried in an ecclesiastical court instead of a secular one. Originally, this was proven by showing evidence of ordination, but over time the test simplified dramatically. If you could read, you were presumed to be a clergyman, because in the early medieval period, literacy was almost exclusively a clerical skill. And eventually, as literacy spread beyond the church, the test narrowed further. If you could recite one specific verse from memory, Psalm 51, verse 1, the so-called neck verse, because it literally saved your neck, you could claim the privilege and be transferred to a church court. The significance of this is enormous once you understand what it meant in practice. Ecclesiastical courts could not impose the death penalty. They could assign penance, they could imprison, they could fine, they could excommunicate, which carried severe social consequences, but was not an execution. So if you could read, or if you could convincingly recite 12 memorized words of Latin, you could escape the hangman entirely for offenses that would kill an illiterate person standing right next to you who had committed the exact same crime in the exact same circumstances. 2 people, same crime, same courtroom, same evidence against them. One lives, one dies. The difference is not innocence or guilt. The difference is not the severity of the offense or the character of the accused. The difference is that one of them can read and the other cannot. The law was not blind here. It could read, and it rewarded the skill handsomely. This was not a loophole that clever defendants exploited against the system's intentions. This was the system working exactly as designed. Clergy were a different category of person, subject to different rules, and if the mechanism for proving clerical status happened to be literacy, and if that meant a literate killer walked free while an illiterate bread thief hanged, well, that was the hierarchy functioning precisely as intended. The injustice was not a bug, it was a feature. None of this was secret. None of it was a malfunction in an otherwise rational machine. This was the machine. It had grown one layer at a time over centuries, each new authority adding its rules and its courts and its fees on top of the last, without anyone ever stepping back to look at the whole sprawling construction and ask whether it held together as a coherent system. It did not, but it functioned. It ground forward, day after day, decade after decade, processing human lives through its overlapping mechanisms. And if you were lucky, if you were attentive, if you had the right connections and the right knowledge, and happened to be standing on the right patch of ground when trouble found you, you could navigate it. If you were not lucky, you found out the hard way, which rules you had broken without knowing they existed. And the hard way, in this world, could mean the loss of everything you had built, everything you owned, and everything your family depended on to survive. And speaking of finding out the hard way over something that seems laughably trivial by modern standards, let us talk about your clothes. You got dressed this morning without thinking much about it. You pulled on whatever was available, whatever was warm enough, whatever felt right for the work ahead. And you have already committed your first crime of the day. Not because you are dressed indecently, not because your clothes are dirty or torn or inappropriate for the weather. You are in trouble because you are dressed above your station. The fabric on your back, the color of your sleeves, the trim on your collar, the width of your belt, the material of your buckle, the length of your shoes, all of these are regulated by law, statute, passed by Parliament, enforced by courts, and you are wearing something that belongs to a social rank you do not occupy. Sumptuary laws. The word comes from the Latin sumptus, meaning expenditure, and the laws were exactly what they sound like. Legal restrictions on what you were allowed to spend your money on, focused primarily on what you were permitted to wear, calibrated precisely to your position in the social hierarchy. These were not guidelines. They were not polite suggestions backed up by nothing more than social disapproval, although social disapproval existed in abundance. They were criminal statutes carrying real penalties imposed by real courts on real people who got caught wearing the wrong thing on the wrong body. The English sumptuary statutes of 1363 under Edward III are a masterpiece of anxious, meticulous social engineering. They lay out, in extraordinary and occasionally bizarre detail, exactly what each rank of person in the kingdom is permitted to put on their body. Knights with annual land rents exceeding 400 marks may wear whatever they please. Knights with rents below 200 marks may not wear cloth of gold, silk outer garments, or furred hoods lined with ermine. Esquires and gentlemen with less than 100 pounds in annual land income may not wear velvet, satin, ermine, or any fabric embroidered with silver. Merchants, citizens, and burgesses may wear clothing appropriate to their declared income, but never the clothing of the rank above them, regardless of whether their actual wealth exceeds that of the gentleman they are forbidden to resemble. And at the bottom, servants, laborers, and agricultural workers are confined to the coarsest, plainest fabrics available. No silk, no embroidery, no imported cloth, no fur beyond lamb, rabbit, cat, or fox, specific furs for specific ranks, specific dyes reserved for specific social positions. Even the pointed shoe, that extraordinary curling tip that fashion demanded on men's footwear during the 14th and 15th centuries, was regulated by class. The poulain, as it was known, could stretch to truly extravagant lengths on the foot of a nobleman, but a commoner's points were restricted to modest proportions by statute. The law had opinions about your toes. It was not shy about sharing them. This is not vanity legislation in the abstract. This is a government looking at the way people dress, panicking about what it means for the social order, and responding with detailed statute. The underlying logic is not complicated once you understand the world it served. Medieval society depended on visual legibility. There were no identification documents. There were no standardized uniforms in the modern sense. When you walked down a street, every person who saw you needed to be able to read your social rank from your appearance, the way you read a name badge at a conference. Your clothing was your credential. It told the world who you were, what you were worth, how much deference you were owed, and how much authority you carried. If you blurred that signal, if you dressed like a gentleman when you were a merchant, or dressed like a knight when you were a prosperous tradesman, you were not making a personal fashion statement. You were committing visual fraud. You were lying about your place in the world, and that lie threatened the legibility of the entire social order that everyone around you depended on to know how to behave. The modern version of this impulse is gentler in its penalties, but structurally identical in its anxieties. Dress codes at private clubs that exist not for comfort or safety, but to signal who belongs and who does not. School uniform policies enforced with detentions over a skirt rolled an inch too short, or a sock in the wrong shade of gray. The unwritten but ruthlessly enforced rules about what you wear to a job interview at a law firm versus a technology startup, where the correct answer is a performance of class identity as precise as anything Edward III ever demanded. The social punishment for carrying a visibly counterfeit designer bag, which is not a criminal offense in most jurisdictions, but functions as a class violation in exactly the way a medieval sumptuary crime did. The instinct to read people by their clothing and to punish those who dress above their perceived station has not gone anywhere. It just lost its court system and migrated to the comments section. Here is where the history becomes genuinely interesting, though, because the sumptuary laws tell a story the people who wrote them never intended to tell. They were passed repeatedly. Edward III in 1363. Further statutes later in the same decade. More under Henry IV. More under Henry VIII. More under Elizabeth. Statute after statute, decade after decade, generation after generation, the government kept writing laws about what people were allowed to wear. And the reason they kept writing new ones is the same reason any law gets reissued over and over again. Nobody was obeying the last one. The sumptuary laws existed precisely because people kept violating them. Merchants' wives kept wearing fur they were not entitled to. Successful tradesmen kept buying silk that belonged to the rank above them. Social climbers kept dressing beyond their station despite the fines, despite the confiscations, despite the public shaming that came with being caught. Every new statute was an admission that the previous statute had failed, and every failure was followed by another fresh, doomed attempt to legislate a problem that legislation was fundamentally incapable of solving. Vanity does not read legislation. It never has, it never will. The human compulsion to dress slightly better than your neighbors is so durable, so profoundly resistant to legal threat, that 5 centuries of sumptuary law could not make a visible dent in it, which is either deeply depressing or quietly reassuring, depending on how you feel about the species. The penalties for getting caught were real, even when enforcement was uneven and selective. Fines were the standard punishment, and they were designed to hurt. For a laborer or artisan caught wearing a garment above his permitted rank, the fine could represent several weeks of wages. A skilled craftsman, earning 4 or 5 pence a day, might face a penalty equivalent to a full month of work or more. Translate that and you are looking at something like receiving a fine that wipes out your entire paycheck for the month. Not for reckless driving, not for theft, not for harming another person in any way, but for wearing a shirt the law decided was too nice for someone in your position. The offending garment itself could be seized on the spot. In some cases, public humiliation was layered onto the financial punishment. A walk through the marketplace stripped of the clothing you were not entitled to wear, dressed instead in whatever the statute allowed for your rank, while everyone in your community watched and understood exactly what you had been trying to get away with. But here is the status flip that nobody expects. The people most aggressively targeted by sumptuary enforcement were not the poor. A peasant in rough homespun wool was invisible to the system. Nobody bothered inspecting a field laborer's wardrobe because a field laborer could not afford to violate the law, even if the thought had crossed his mind. The system aimed its attention squarely at the middle, the merchants, the wealthy townspeople, the ambitious guild members and successful traders whose incomes were climbing faster than their social rank could follow. These were the people who could afford silk and fur, who wanted silk and fur, who bought silk and fur, and who therefore drew the enforcing eye of a system designed specifically to keep them from looking like something they were not born to be. The wealthier you became without being noble, the more dangerous your wardrobe became. Your own success made you visible, and visibility made you a target. Being rich enough to buy the good fabric, but not well-born enough to be permitted to wear it, was the specific, grinding trap the sumptuary system set for the rising middle, and it caught people in it for centuries. This is the particular absurdity of sumptuary law that deserves sitting with for a moment. It did not punish crime in any sense a modern person would recognize. It did not punish harm. It did not protect anyone from injury or loss or danger of any kind. It punished ambition made visible. It punished the evidence that the social hierarchy was not as natural, not as permanent, and not as divinely fixed as the people sitting at the top of it needed everyone to believe. Every merchant's wife who walked through the market wearing an ermine-trimmed cloak was a walking contradiction to the fiction that social rank was a matter of blood and birth rather than money and nerve, and that made her dangerous. Not dangerous to public safety, not dangerous to morality or order, dangerous to the story, dangerous to the comfortable, flattering narrative that the people at the top belonged there because God and nature had placed them there, and that everyone else should stay exactly where they were. You have worked your entire life. You have built something real with your hands, and your judgment, and your willingness to take risks that most people would not take. You have earned more money than some of the minor gentry in the next village. You can afford the finest bolt of cloth the merchant has on offer, and the law says you may not buy it. Not because the purchase would hurt anyone, not because the fabric is contraband, not because the transaction is fraudulent, but because wearing it would make you look like someone who matters more than you are legally supposed to matter. The fabric exists, the money exists, the desire exists. The only thing standing between you and the coat you want is a statute written by men who were already wearing exactly what they forbade you from wearing, passed specifically to ensure that when the world looks at you, it sees exactly and only what the social hierarchy has decided you are worth. Vanity is eternal. And so, it turns out, is the impulse to legislate it in everyone except yourself. The sumptuary laws failed for 500 years and were reintroduced after every failure, because the anxiety they were designed to soothe, that quiet, persistent terror that the wrong people might start looking like the right people, never went away. It never does. It just keeps finding new fabrics to worry about. Every generation invents a fresh mechanism to say you are not allowed to look like you belong here, and every generation of ambitious, stubborn, gloriously vain human beings finds a way to ignore it. And if the law cared this much about the thread count of your shirt, you can only imagine how it felt about the trees. The trees are not yours. That is the first thing you need to know, and the thing that will be hardest to accept. You are looking at a forest that stretches for miles in every direction, thick with oak and beech and elm, full of deer and boar and rabbits, carpeted with fallen branches and undergrowth and mushrooms, and none of it belongs to you. Not the wood, not the animals, not the fruit on the branches, not the nuts on the ground, not even the dead sticks lying in the dirt beneath your feet. All of it, every leaf and every creature moving through the shadows, is the personal property of the king. And the king has built an entire legal system separate from every other legal system you have already encountered tonight, for the sole purpose of making sure you do not touch any of it. Welcome to forest law, and welcome to one of the most bitterly resented bodies of legislation in English history. The royal forests were not what you think they were. The word forest in this context does not mean a dense woodland. It means a legally designated area, often enormous, placed under the direct authority of the crown, and governed by a special set of laws that superseded everything else. Royal forests included woodlands, yes, but they also included open heathland, agricultural fields, villages, farms, pastures, and entire communities of people who happened to live inside the boundaries. At the peak of the system, under the Norman and early Plantagenet kings, as much as a third of the land in England was designated royal forest. 1/3 of the country, and everyone living inside it, was subject to a code of law that existed for one purpose and one purpose only: to protect the king's hunting. That is not an exaggeration. Forest law was game law. It existed to preserve the deer and the woodland habitat the deer required, because the king wanted to hunt, and hunting required a healthy population of animals living in undisturbed territory. Everything else, every restriction, every punishment, every court, every officer, every fine flowed from that single priority. Your need for firewood did not matter. Your need to graze your animals did not matter. Your need to clear land for crops so your family could eat through the winter did not matter. The deer mattered. You were an inconvenience living inside the deer's home, and the law treated you accordingly. The comfortable lie here is one that sounds perfectly reasonable until you think about it for more than a moment. You assume the forest was wild land, open land, land that belonged to nobody in particular and was available to everyone, commons, in the truest sense of the word, a place where any person could hunt a rabbit for dinner, gather fallen branches for fuel, let their pigs root for acorns, and walk freely without permission. After all, the trees were just there. They grew on their own. Nobody planted them, nobody tended them. The forest was just nature, doing what nature does, and the idea that nature could be owned and that using it without permission could be a hanging offense seems almost absurd from a modern perspective, but it was not absurd in this world. It was the law. The forest was the king's property, as surely as the castle was the king's property, and taking from it without authorization was theft from the crown. The Norman kings who imported forest law into England after 1066 did not invent the concept from nothing, but they transformed it into something far more aggressive and far-reaching than anything the Anglo-Saxon system had known. Before the conquest, English kings had hunting grounds and restricted areas, but the scale was modest and the penalties were moderate. William the Conqueror looked at the English landscape and saw not a kingdom of people to govern, but a hunting preserve to be protected, and he drew forest boundaries with a scope that stunned and infuriated the existing population. The New Forest in Hampshire, created by William around 1079, reportedly involved the destruction of entire villages and the forced removal of their inhabitants to create an uninterrupted tract of hunting land. Whether the chronicles exaggerate the scale of the clearances is debated by historians, but the emotional reality is not. People were displaced so that deer could graze undisturbed, and everyone in England knew it. The message was not subtle. The king's entertainment was worth more than your home. This was not simply a matter of game preservation. It was an assertion of total ownership over the landscape itself. The royal forest was a statement that the land, every inch of it within the designated boundary, existed for the king's pleasure before it existed for anyone else's survival. And that principle, once established, proved remarkably difficult to dislodge. Forest boundaries expanded under successive kings. Henry II pushed them further. Richard the Lionheart and John pushed them further still, in part because afforestation, the process of designating new land as royal forest, was a reliable source of revenue. Every new acre of forest meant new fines, new licensing fees, new pannage and grazing charges, new opportunities for the crown and its officers to extract money from the people living inside the boundary. The forest was not just a hunting ground, it was a revenue machine, and expanding it was cheaper and more politically convenient than raising taxes. The penalties were savage, particularly in the early period. Under William the Conqueror and his son William Rufus, poaching a deer from a royal forest could be punished by blinding or castration. Not imprisonment, not a fine. The physical destruction of your body, carried out as a deliberate statement about the relative value the crown placed on a deer versus a peasant. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records, with a kind of stunned disapproval, that William loved the tall deer as if he were their father, and that he set up such protections for them that whoever killed a hart or a hind should be blinded. The chronicler was not exaggerating for dramatic effect. He was describing a legal reality that people lived under every day. A deer was worth more than your eyes. A hart was worth more than your ability to see your own children. Later kings softened the penalties, or at least redirected them into forms that generated revenue rather than simply generating hatred. Henry II replaced most of the mutilation punishments with heavy fines and imprisonment, partly because permanently maiming your own productive population turned out to be bad policy, and partly because fines filled the treasury, while blinding people just filled the countryside with resentment. But the fundamental architecture remained unchanged for centuries. The forest was the king's. Everything in it was the king's. And taking anything from it without explicit, paid-for permission was a crime, tried in the king's forest courts by the king's forest officers under the king's forest law, which operated independently from every other legal system in the kingdom. And what counted as taking something from the forest was defined with a breadth that would astonish you. Killing a deer was the most serious offense, obviously, the crime that justified the entire system's existence. But cutting a tree without authorization was a crime. Clearing undergrowth from land you were trying to farm was a crime. Gathering fallen wood could be a crime, depending on the local interpretation of your customary rights. And those interpretations varied wildly from one forest to the next. Grazing your pigs on forest land without a pannage license was a crime. Grazing your cattle without authorization was a crime. Building a fence or a hedge that might impede the free movement of deer was a crime. Keeping a dog that had not been lawed, a process that involved cutting 3 claws from each front paw to ensure the animal could not chase deer effectively, was a crime. Simply owning a bough within the forest boundaries could be treated as evidence of intent to poach, whether or not you had ever aimed it at anything more regal than a tree stump. The forest officers who enforced all of this were a world unto themselves. Verderers, foresters, regarders, woodwards, and adjusters, each with specific duties, specific jurisdictions, and a deeply personal financial interest in making sure the system generated as many fines and as many opportunities for quiet personal profit as possible. The foresters in particular were infamous across medieval England. These were the men who patrolled the forest daily, on foot or on horseback, and they were frequently enthusiastically corrupt. A forester who caught you gathering wood or grazing an unlicensed animal had 2 options. He could report you to the forest court, where you would face official penalties assessed by the court and collected for the crown, or he could accept a quiet payment on the spot to forget he had ever seen you. Both options cost you money. The difference was who received it. The system was designed so that the forester profited, regardless of whether he enforced the law honestly or broke it for a bribe, and the person standing in front of him with an armful of sticks paid either way. The forest courts themselves operated on a schedule that compounded the misery. 3 levels of court-handled forest offenses. The Court of Attachment met every 40 days to record offenses and hold suspects. The Swanimote met 3 times a year to review forest business. And the Justice Seat, the highest forest court, met at irregular intervals, sometimes years apart, to try the serious cases. This meant that a person accused of a forest offense might wait months or even years for their case to be heard, during which time they remained under suspicion, potentially unable to work, and accumulating costs they could not control. The system was not designed for swift resolution. It was designed for accumulation. Offenses piled up, fines compounded, and the person at the bottom of the pile sank deeper with every passing season. Think about what this meant for the people who actually lived inside the royal forests, not poachers creeping through the undergrowth at midnight, not outlaws living beyond the law's reach. Ordinary families, farming the same land their grandparents had farmed, attending the same church, paying their rents, doing their labor service, who woke up one day inside a legal boundary that turned their daily existence into a series of potential crimes. You need firewood to survive the winter. The wood is lying on the ground 10 yards from your door. Picking it up is illegal. You need to feed your pigs. The acorns are falling from the oaks in the forest your village has used for generations beyond counting. Letting your pigs eat them without paying for a pannage license is illegal. You need to repair your fence. Cutting a branch from a living tree to make a new fence post is illegal. Every basic act of survival, every task that keeps your family warm, fed, and sheltered, requires you to either break the law or pay someone for permission to do what your family has done freely for as long as anyone can remember. The fines for forest offenses were calibrated to ruin. A peasant household caught taking timber without authorization might face a penalty of several shillings, which does not sound catastrophic until you translate it into what those shillings actually represented in human labor. A laborer earning 2 pence a day would need to work for weeks to cover a single forest fine. A fine of 5 shillings meant 60 pence, which meant 30 full days of labor at a daily rate that left absolutely nothing for food, rent, tithe, or any other obligation. And forest fines were not a one-time risk. If you lived inside the forest, you were subject to these rules every single day of your life. A single bad month, a single desperate winter where you took wood you were not supposed to take because the alternative was watching your family freeze, could generate a debt that followed you for years and grew with every court session you could not pay your way out of. And here is where the parasite chain becomes visible. The forester who caught you expected his bribe or his fee for filing the report. The forest court that tried you charged attendance fines and administrative costs that you were required to pay regardless of the outcome. The verderer who presided took his cut. The amercement, the fine itself, went to the crown. And you, the person who needed a bundle of sticks to keep your children warm through February, absorbed every cost at every single stage of the process. Everyone in the chain profited. The king profited from the fine. The officers profited from their fees and their bribes. The court profited from its administrative charges. The only person who did not profit, the only person who'd walked away poorer than when they arrived, was the one person whose survival depended on the resource the entire system was built to keep away from them. The Charter of the Forest, issued in 1217, alongside the more famous Magna Carta, was an attempt to rein in the worst of these abuses. It reduced the forest boundaries substantially, returning large areas of land to the common law. It restored certain customary rights, including the right of free men to take limited amounts of wood and to graze limited numbers of animals within the forest. It abolished the death penalty and mutilation for forest offenses permanently, and it placed restrictions on the behavior of forest officers, attempting to curb the corruption that had made the system as hated as it was. The fact that it took a constitutional crisis, a baronial revolt, and one of the most significant political upheavals in English history to achieve the right to pick up sticks from the floor of a forest tells you everything you need to know about how far the system had pushed ordinary people before something finally broke. The Charter of the Forest is one of the most important legal documents in English history, and most people have never heard of it, because the rights it protected, the right to gather fuel, the right to feed your animals on common land, the right to survive on the same ground your ancestors had used for centuries, sound so basic, so obviously reasonable, that it is difficult to believe anyone ever had to fight for them in a formal legal document. But they did. They fought for those rights, because a legal system built entirely around the protection of the king's deer had quietly, systematically, turned their daily existence into a criminal act, and the only way to stop it was to force the crown to put their survival rights in writing. The forest and its laws cast a long shadow across English history. Even after the charter curtailed the worst excesses, the principle remained embedded in law for centuries afterward. The land belonged to the crown. The resources belonged to the crown. Your access to them was a privilege granted by authority, not a right you carried with you, and that privilege could be revoked, restricted, or taxed at any moment by anyone with the power to do so. You could live your entire life within walking distance of more wood than you could burn in a decade, and still face genuine hardship, because the law said that wood was not yours to touch. But of course, the king was not the only authority with strong opinions about what you were allowed to do with your hands. The market had rules too, and the market's rules were, in their own quiet way, just as capable of destroying you over almost nothing. Step out of the forest and into the town, and the smell changes. Wood smoke and damp earth give way to something sharper, denser, more human. Livestock, baking bread, open drains running with things you would rather not identify. The particular tang of a crowd of people who work hard and bathe infrequently, pressed into a space designed for half their number. This is market day, and the square is packed. Stalls and trestle tables crowd the open ground between the buildings. Voices compete over each other, and over the bleating and lowing of animals tethered at the edges. Somewhere a bell is ringing to mark the official opening of trade, and that bell matters more than you think, because in this world, even the simple act of buying and selling food is regulated with a precision that would make a modern compliance department feel right at home. The Assize of bread and ale is where it starts. First formally codified in 1266, though its roots stretch back further into custom, the Assize was a royal regulation that fixed the weight and price of bread and the price and quality of ale in direct, mathematical proportion to the current cost of grain. It was not a suggestion. It was not a guideline that bakers could interpret loosely and hope for the best. It was a binding formula, enforced by locally appointed officials, with specific, public, physically unpleasant penalties for anyone who got the numbers wrong. Here is how it worked in practice. The price of a standard loaf of bread was fixed by the Assize. You could not charge more, regardless of your costs. What the regulation allowed to fluctuate was the weight. When grain was cheap, your loaf had to be heavier. When grain was expensive, your loaf was permitted to be lighter. The formula was mathematically precise. It specified the exact weight a farthing loaf, a halfpenny loaf, and a penny loaf should achieve at any given grain price. The baker's profit margin was built into the formula, and it was thin, brutally thin. If the cost of grain rose faster than the Assize formula adjusted, your margin could vanish entirely, and you were still legally required to bake and sell at the mandated weight. Absorb the loss, bake the bread, sell it at the price the Assize dictates. And if you shaved a few ounces off the loaf to protect what little margin remained, and the inspector caught you, you were no longer a struggling baker, you were a criminal. The punishment for selling underweight bread was not a quiet fine paid at the courthouse. It was the pillory. The baker was physically locked into a wooden frame erected in the public square. The underweight loaf hung around his neck as material evidence of his crime for all to see, and the community was invited to gather, to watch, to comment, and in some places and some periods, to throw things. The Pillory and Tumbrel Statute of 1266, formalized these penalties with uncomfortable specificity. Bakers, who violated the Assize, could be pilloried for a first offense, pilloried again for a second, and for a persistent third offense, their oven could be demolished, and they could be permanently banished from the baking trade. Your livelihood, the craft you had spent years learning as an apprentice, and years more perfecting as a journeyman, the oven your family's survival depended on, all of it gone, because a loaf of bread weighed a few ounces less than a formula written by people who had never baked anything in their lives said it should. This is where the baker's dozen comes from, 13 for the price of 12. Bakers began habitually including an extra loaf or roll in every batch they sold to retailers and to inspectors, not out of generosity or good customer relations, but out of terror. The penalty for being caught short was so severe, so public, and so destructive that bakers systematically preferred to give away free product rather than risk even the possibility that a single loaf in a large batch might weigh in under the required standard. The 13th loaf was insurance. It was a buffer. It was the medieval baker's way of saying, I would rather absorb a small daily loss than risk losing my oven, my livelihood, my standing in this community, and my dignity in the town square on a busy market day. The ale side of the Assize deserves its own moment, because ale was not a luxury. It was a staple. In a world where water sources were frequently contaminated and milk spoiled quickly without refrigeration, ale was what most people drank with most meals, including breakfast. Brewing was one of the most common trades in any medieval community, and it was overwhelmingly a woman's trade. The alewife, the woman who brewed and sold ale from her home, was a fixture of village life, and she was fined constantly. The ale taster, that locally appointed official, checked her product for quality and her measures for accuracy, and the immersements for selling weak ale, short measures, or ale brewed outside the approved standards, filled the manor court rolls with a regularity that suggests the fines were less about enforcement and more about revenue. Some historians have argued that immersements on alewives functioned essentially as a brewing tax, a regular cost of doing business that the women factored into their pricing and the court factored into its income. The line between punishment and taxation blurred so thoroughly that it is not always clear which one the system was actually practicing. Now follow a single loaf through the system and watch how many hands touch it, how many fees attach to it, and how many potential crimes are embedded in it before it reaches the person who actually eats it. The grain starts in a field, grown by a tenant farmer who pays rent to his lord in either labor or a share of the harvest. The grain goes to a miller who grinds it into flour for a fee called a multurer, and millers were so universally famous for taking more than their legal share that Chaucer built an entire character around the accusation. The dishonest miller was a medieval stereotype so reliable, so widely recognized, that simply saying the word miller to a medieval audience carried an automatic suggestion of theft. The flour goes to a baker, who shapes it, bakes it in an oven that may itself be subject to a separate licensing fee, and sells it at a price he did not set, for a weight he must hit precisely on pain of public punishment. An appointed inspector, the bread weigher or ale taster, depending on the community, checks the finished loaf against the Assize standard using scales that may or may not be accurately calibrated. If the loaf fails inspection, the baker faces the pillory. And the person who finally eats the bread, the laborer, spending a penny to put food on his family's table, has no idea how many regulations, fees, inspections, potential crimes, and competing economic interests were embedded in the simple object sitting in front of him. Every loaf of bread was a small legal drama with a full cast of characters. Most of them ended quietly. Some of them ended in the public square with a man locked in a wooden frame and a loaf hanging from his neck. But bread was only the beginning of what the market could punish you for. The medieval trading environment was regulated at every level by laws that sound almost quaint in their vocabulary, until you understand what they could cost a person in practice. Forestalling. This was the crime of buying goods before they reached the open market. If a farmer was bringing grain or livestock to town, and you met him on the road, negotiated a price, and purchased his goods before he reached the market square, you were a forestaller. It did not matter that the farmer was willing. It did not matter that the price was fair. The crime was the timing and the location. The open market was supposed to be a level field, where all buyers had equal access to all goods at publicly visible prices. Buying before the goods reached that field, in a private transaction no one else could see or compete with, was treated as a form of cheating. The punishment ranged from fines to the pillory to permanent banishment from the market, depending on the severity and the mood of the court. Regrading. This was the crime of buying goods at market and then reselling them in the same market or nearby at a higher price. You bought low and sold high in the same place on the same day. Today, this is the foundational principle of virtually every retail business on the planet. In the medieval market, it was a criminal act. The moral framework that governed trade held that goods had a just price, a fair value rooted in the cost of production and the customary expectations of the community. Anyone who artificially inflated that price through speculative buying and reselling was not engaging in commerce. They were engaging in exploitation, engrossing. This was the crime of buying up large quantities of a commodity, particularly grain, to control supply and drive prices higher. Hoarding food during a shortage to sell it later at inflated prices was engrossing, and it was treated with particular severity because in a community where a bad harvest could mean genuine starvation, artificial manipulation of the grain supply was not an economic offense. It was an attack on the survival of the community. The punishment could include imprisonment, confiscation, and destruction of the hoarded goods, and permanent expulsion from all trade. Think about what these three crimes mean when you stack them together. Buying groceries before the market officially opens is a crime. Reselling something you just bought at a markup is a crime. Buying large quantities of anything is a crime. These are not obscure, forgotten regulations buried in dusty statute books. They were actively, regularly enforced laws backed by real punishments that could destroy a trader's livelihood and reputation in a single afternoon. A modern commodities broker's entire career would constitute a continuous criminal enterprise in a 14th century English market town. The concept of buying low and selling high, the engine of virtually every economic system that has existed since the medieval period ended, was quite literally against the law. The enforcement mechanism was, as with so much else in this world, your neighbors. Market regulations were policed by appointed officials, but accusations came overwhelmingly from the community. If your neighbor saw you buying grain on the road outside town an hour before market opened, your neighbor could report you. If your competitor in the next stall noticed you adjusting your prices upward after making a bulk purchase at a lower rate, your competitor could drag you before the court. The market was a surveillance environment dressed up as a community space. Everyone was watching everyone else, and while the stated justification was the protection of fair trading for all, the practical reality was that reporting a competitor's violation was one of the most effective tools of business competition available. The law was a weapon, and it was aimed sideways as often as it was aimed at genuine wrongdoing. And here is the modern mirror that makes all of this feel closer than it should. Health inspectors who can shut down a restaurant over a violation most diners would never taste. Food safety regulations that require thousands of pages of compliance documentation for a product that has been made the same way for decades. Licensing requirements that exist, in theory, to protect the public, but function, in practice, as gatekeeping mechanisms that established businesses use to keep new competitors from entering the market. The sign in the window that says this establishment received an A rating from the health department is a direct descendant of the medieval bread weigher checking your loaf against the Assize standard. The instinct to regulate what people eat, how it is made, who is allowed to sell it, and at what price, is structurally identical to what you are standing in the middle of right now. The medieval version just had a pillory, where the modern version has a Yelp review. The guild system layered another entire regulatory structure on top of all this. Guilds controlled who was allowed to practice a trade, the methods they used, the prices they charged, and how many apprentices they could train. If you were a baker, you needed guild membership. If you were a brewer, you needed guild approval. If you were a butcher, a chandler, a weaver, or a smith, the guild set the rules, monitored compliance, and punished violations with fines, suspension, or permanent expulsion. The guilds framed their authority as quality control. They were ensuring that only properly trained, competent craftsmen served the public, and that shoddy work did not endanger the community's reputation. There was truth in that. Guild standards were real, and guild training produced genuinely skilled workers. But guilds were also monopolies, and monopolies protect their members' incomes by restricting the supply of competitors. Fewer bakers means higher bread prices and wider margins for every baker inside the guild. Limiting entry to the trade is not just quality control, it is market control, and the guild system practiced both simultaneously, with no apparent discomfort. The crime of practicing a trade without guild membership was called intrusion, and it was punished seriously. Your goods could be confiscated. You could be fined, banned from the market, or in repeated cases, subjected to physical punishment. Being skilled at your craft was not a defense. Being cheaper than guild prices was not a virtue. It was evidence of undercutting, which was functionally the same crime the sumptuary laws punished, applied to commerce instead of clothing. You are not allowed to succeed beyond your assigned position, and if you try, the system will invent a name for what you are doing and a punishment to match. All of this rested on a moral framework that is almost entirely alien to the modern mind, even though its echoes appear everywhere you look. The medieval market was not understood as a neutral arena where supply and demand set prices through impersonal forces. It was understood as a moral space where just prices, fair wages, and honest dealing were obligations owed to the community and, ultimately, to God. Making more money than the community believed you were supposed to make was not clever. It was sinful. Charging more than the just price was not optimization. It was theft from your neighbors, dressed in a merchant's clothes. The entire economic vocabulary of exploitation, greed, unfair advantage, and profiteering that modern critics of capitalism use instinctively would have been perfectly intelligible to a medieval market regulator, because they were already using exactly those words, and they had courts and pillories and the power to destroy livelihoods to enforce them. The irony, of course, is that the system designed to ensure fairness and honest dealing was itself shot through with corruption, favoritism, and selective enforcement. The rules applied to everyone in theory, and to your enemies in practice. The market was a moral space, but morality was administered by human beings with human grudges, human friendships, and human financial interests. And human beings with the power to punish tend to punish the people they dislike more energetically than the people they owe favors to. Justice in the marketplace was real, in the sense that people genuinely were fined, pilloried, and ruined for selling underweight bread or buying grain at the wrong time of morning. But it was also selective, in the sense that who got caught and who got quietly overlooked had as much to do with personal relationships and local politics as it did with the actual weight of the loaf or the hour of the purchase. But even the market, with all its rules about bread and grain and the correct time of day to buy an onion, looks almost reasonable compared to what happened when the law turned its attention from your clothes and your commerce to the inside of your mind. Because the most dangerous thing you could do in this world was not wear the wrong shirt, or pick up the wrong stick, or sell the wrong loaf at the wrong weight. The most dangerous thing you could do was think the wrong thought. And the system that existed to punish wrong thoughts had its own courts, its own prisons, its own investigative procedures, and its own very particular way of making sure you never thought wrong again. The church did not share. That is the simplest way to understand what is about to happen to you. It did not share authority. It did not share truth. It did not share the right to interpret the words of God with anyone who had not been specifically, institutionally authorized to do so. And the mechanism it built to protect that monopoly was not a suggestion box or a sternly worded pastoral letter. It was a legal system with courts, prisons, interrogation procedures, and the power to hand you over to the secular authorities for execution if you persisted in believing the wrong thing with insufficient repentance. You are about to enter the world of heresy law. And the first thing you need to know is that heresy did not mean what you think it means. The comfortable lie here is dramatic and cinematic. You imagine heresy as rebellion, bold, defiant, obvious. A person standing in the town square, shaking their fist at the church, rejecting God, burning crosses, and daring the bishop to do something about it. The medieval heretic in popular imagination is a revolutionary, a proto-atheist, a dramatic figure who chose to fight the most powerful institution on earth and paid the ultimate price for moral courage. That version makes a good movie. It has almost nothing to do with how heresy actually worked. Most people accused of heresy considered themselves good Christians, devout Christians, Christians who prayed regularly, attended services faithfully, observed the feast days, gave their tithes, and genuinely believed they were living in accordance with God's will. The problem was not that they rejected the church. The problem was that they held a specific belief, often an obscure doctrinal position that most modern people could not even distinguish from the officially approved version that happened to contradict the teaching of the church at that particular moment in that particular jurisdiction. Heresy was not about rejection. It was about deviation, and the distance between orthodox belief and heretical belief could be so small, so technical, so dependent on the precise theological vocabulary you use to describe an abstract spiritual concept, that a person could cross from safety into mortal danger without ever realizing they had taken a single step. Consider what this means in practice. You believe in God. You believe in Christ. You attend church every week. You take communion. You pray daily. You observe Lent and keep the fasts. By every visible measure, you are a faithful member of your community. But somewhere along the way, in a conversation with a neighbor, in a moment of genuine spiritual reflection late at night, you formed an opinion about the nature of the Eucharist, or the extent of papal authority, or the proper relationship between Scripture and church tradition. That does not quite match the position your bishop considers orthodox this year. You did not read a banned book. You did not join a secret movement. You did not set out to challenge anyone. You simply thought about your faith with sincerity, and arrived at a conclusion that the institutional church had decided was incorrect. And that conclusion, held quietly in your own heart, shared perhaps with a friend or a family member in a moment of trust, is a capital offense. The institutional machinery for prosecuting heresy developed gradually, but by the 13th century, it was formidable and terrifyingly efficient. The Episcopal Inquisition, conducted by local bishops within their own dioceses, had been operating in various forms since the late 12th century. Bishops had always claimed the authority to investigate and correct false belief within their jurisdictions, but the process was inconsistent, dependent on individual initiative, and limited by the bishop's other responsibilities. The Papal Inquisition, established in the 1230s under Pope Gregory IX, changed the scale entirely. It created a dedicated class of professional investigators, usually drawn from the Dominican and Franciscan orders, whose sole job was to seek out heresy, investigate it methodically, and bring it before church tribunals. These were not amateur operations staffed by village priests who happened to overhear something suspicious. The inquisitors were trained theologians. They were methodical and patient. They kept meticulous records. They developed sophisticated interrogation techniques, and they had access to tools of investigation that would make a modern prosecutor profoundly uncomfortable. The process typically began with an accusation, which could come from virtually any direction. A neighbor who heard you say something questionable, a priest who noticed you seemed insufficiently enthusiastic about a particular doctrine, a business rival who knew that a heresy accusation was an effective way to destroy a competitor, a disgruntled spouse, or a former friend with a grudge and a willingness to weaponize the church court system. The source of the accusation mattered less than the accusation itself. Once reported, the machinery began to turn. The accused was summoned before an inquisitorial tribunal, where they were questioned about their beliefs in detail. The questioning was specific and designed to draw out any deviation from orthodox teaching, often through questions that seemed harmless on the surface but contained theological traps. The accused was not always told what the specific charge was. They were not always told who had accused them. They were sometimes not even told what the correct answer to a particular question was supposed to be, which created the surreal situation where a genuinely faithful person could condemn themselves out of honest ignorance about which of two nearly identical theological positions the Church currently endorsed as the correct one. You could believe the right thing, express it in slightly the wrong words, and find yourself on the wrong side of an investigation that had the power to destroy you. After 1252, when Pope Innocent IV issued the papal bull Ad Extirpanda, torture was formally authorized as a legitimate tool of inquisitorial investigation. The bull specified that heretics should be compelled to confess their errors and to name their accomplices, just as robbers and thieves are compelled to confess. The use of torture was theoretically limited by regulations. It was to be applied only when substantial evidence already suggested guilt. It was not supposed to cause permanent injury, loss of limb, or death, and confessions extracted under torture were required to be freely confirmed afterward, away from the torture chamber, as a procedural safeguard against false admissions of guilt. In practice, every one of these limitations proved elastic. The definition of substantial evidence expanded to meet the needs of the investigation. The line between acceptable suffering and permanent injury blurred when the interrogator was convinced the subject was withholding truth, and the requirement to freely confirm a tortured confession afterward, voluntarily and without coercion, was somewhat undermined by the implicit understanding that refusing to confirm meant returning to the room where the confession had been extracted in the first place. The penalties for heresy were graduated with a precision that revealed the system's priorities. A first offense, if the accused recanted sincerely and demonstrated genuine contrition, might be punished with public penance, a period of fasting, wearing a yellow cross sewn onto your clothing so that everyone in your community could identify you as a repentant heretic, mandatory pilgrimage, confiscation of property, or imprisonment. A relapsed heretic, someone who recanted and was reconciled to the Church and then returned to their previous beliefs, faced the most severe consequence. And a stubborn, unrepentant heretic who refused to recant at all was relaxed to the secular arm, a euphemism so transparent it barely qualifies as one, meaning the Church declared you incorrigible and handed you to the state with the calm understanding that the state would carry out the execution the Church could not be seen performing with its own hands. The Church did not kill heretics. The Church merely identified them, tried them, found them guilty, and delivered them to people who did. Burning at the stake was the standard method of execution for heresy across most of medieval Europe. The theological logic behind burning was specific. Fire purified. It destroyed the corrupted body entirely, leaving nothing that could be venerated as a relic. And it was spectacularly, deliberately public. A burning was not conducted quietly in a prison yard. It was a civic event performed before the entire community in a public square, designed not just to punish the individual heretic, but to impress upon every single person watching the absolute, non-negotiable consequences of thinking wrong. The smoke rising over the town was not just an execution, it was a sermon. It was a message addressed to every mind in the crowd. Think carefully about what you believe. Look carefully at what you say, because this is where wrong thoughts end. The burning of William Sawtry in 1401, the first person executed under the English statute de heretico comburendo, illustrates the system's workings with painful clarity. Sawtry was a parish priest, a man who had devoted his entire adult life to the church. His crime was holding Lollard beliefs, the reformist positions influenced by John Wycliffe, that questioned, among many other things, the doctrine of transubstantiation. Transubstantiation was the teaching that the bread and wine of the Eucharist, literally, physically, miraculously, become the body and blood of Christ during the ceremony of communion. Sawtry believed the bread remained bread. That was the belief that killed him, not a rejection of God, not a rejection of Christ, not a rejection of Christianity, the Church, or the fundamental moral teachings of his faith. A disagreement about what physically happens to a piece of bread during a specific ritual, held by a priest who sincerely believed he was being more faithful to Scripture than the institution that had ordained him. The Lollard movement produced dozens of cases, like Sawtry's, across the 15th century. Men and women who believed the Bible should be available in English so that ordinary laypeople could read Scripture for themselves, rather than depending on the clergy's interpretation. Men and women who questioned the immense wealth of the Church, the sale of indulgences, the veneration of saints' relics, the authority of the Pope. These were not nihilists. They were not anarchists, trying to burn down the religious order. They were devout, often deeply pious Christians who believed the Church had drifted away from its own foundational teachings, and they were imprisoned, tortured, and burned for saying so. The crime of possessing a Bible, translated into the vernacular, into the language ordinary people actually spoke, was a real, actively prosecuted offense in some periods and jurisdictions, punishable by imprisonment or death, because the institutional Church understood with perfect clarity that if ordinary people could read the words of God for themselves, they might arrive at conclusions the institution had not authorized. And here is the status flip that cuts through the romantic image of the medieval Church as a shepherd protecting an ignorant flock. The people most likely to face heresy charges were not the ignorant or the indifferent. They were the educated, the literate, the theologically curious. The people who engaged with their faith intellectually and took the effort to think carefully about what they believed and why. A peasant who held vaguely heterodox opinions about the saints while digging turnips was unlikely to attract the Inquisition's attention, because peasants were not expected to have theological opinions sophisticated enough to qualify as heresy in the first place. Their ignorance was their protection. But a priest who questioned transubstantiation, a university scholar who challenged papal supremacy, a literate merchant who had read Wycliffe's writings and found the arguments compelling, these were the dangerous ones. They had the knowledge to articulate alternative positions and the social standing to make other people listen. Knowing too much about your own religion was more dangerous than knowing nothing. Having an informed, considered opinion about the faith you were required to profess was more perilous than having no opinion at all. The system did not punish unbelief. It punished unauthorized belief, which was a far more targeted and far more terrifying thing. The definition of heresy also shifted over time, which made the danger unpredictable in a way that mere severity could not. Theological positions that were tolerated or even encouraged in one century could become criminal in the next, as popes changed, as political alliances shifted, as new bishops brought new theological priorities to their dioceses. Jan Hus, the Czech reformer, was invited to the Council of Constance in 1414 under an explicit guarantee of safe conduct from the Holy Roman Emperor, meaning he was promised he could attend, speak, and leave freely, regardless of what he said. He was arrested, tried for heresy, and burned at the stake in 1415, while the safe conduct guarantee was explained away as not applying to heretics. The lesson was clear and brutal. Not only could the definition of heresy change, but the promises made to you before the definition changed could be retroactively voided once the change caught you on the wrong side. Blasphemy laws operated at a lower level than heresy, but cast a vastly wider net across the population. Where heresy concerned belief, the internal content of your mind and soul, blasphemy concerned speech, the external expression of irreverence toward sacred things, cursing God, swearing by the saints in inappropriate contexts, speaking irreverently about the sacraments, the clergy, or holy objects, using the name of Christ as an exclamation of frustration rather than a prayer. All of these were offenses triable in ecclesiastical courts and, in some jurisdictions, in secular courts as well. The penalties were typically less severe than those for heresy, ranging from fines to public penance to time in the stocks or the pillory. But the enforcement net was enormous, because a blasphemy accusation required no theological investigation, no panel of learned Dominican inquisitors, no extended examination of your doctrinal positions. It required only a neighbor who overheard you say the wrong word at the wrong volume at the wrong moment and decided to report it. The vanity echo here is uncomfortable, but impossible to avoid. The instinct to punish people for expressing the wrong opinions, to treat certain words and certain beliefs as so inherently dangerous that they must be suppressed by authority, is not a medieval artifact preserved in amber for modern audiences to study from a safe historical distance. It wears different institutional clothing now. The enforcement mechanisms are different. The specific consequences are less physically violent. But the underlying architecture, the conviction that wrong thoughts are dangerous, that wrong speech must be policed, that the boundaries of acceptable belief and acceptable expression should be defined and enforced by those with the power to punish deviation, is recognizable in every century that has existed since these trials were conducted, including the one you are lying in bed listening to right now. The tools change, the vocabulary changes, the impulse does not move an inch. But if the system for punishing wrong beliefs seems alien enough, the system for determining whether you committed any crime at all, the actual mechanism medieval courts used to establish guilt or innocence before passing sentence, makes everything you have heard so far tonight sound almost reasonable by comparison. Because before anything resembling a modern trial existed, before juries and evidence and witnesses and the presumption of innocence, there was the ordeal. And the ordeal was exactly what it sounds like. You are standing in a church, not a courthouse, not a secular legal chamber, a church. The distinction matters profoundly, because the trial you are about to undergo is not a legal proceeding in any sense you would recognize. It is a religious ceremony, a liturgy, a formal, sacred appeal to God Himself to reveal the truth through what happens to your body. Because human beings are fallible and prone to deception, but God is not. And the surest way to determine whether you are guilty or innocent is to subject your flesh to a physical test that only divine intervention can influence. Trial by hot iron worked like this. A priest conducted a formal liturgy, blessing a bar of iron and heating it in a fire until it glowed red. You were required to pick up this bar in your bare hand and carry it for a prescribed distance, usually 9 feet, roughly 3 measured paces, across the stone floor of the church. Your burned hand was then carefully wrapped in a clean bandage and sealed with the priest's seal so it could not be tampered with. 3 days later, the bandage was removed and the wound was inspected by the presiding official. If the burn was healing cleanly, showing new pink skin and no infection, God had judged you innocent. The clean healing was God's mark upon your body, His declaration that you had not committed the act you were accused of. If the wound was festering, if the flesh was angry and swollen and showing signs of corruption, God had judged you guilty. The infection was His verdict. Your guilt or innocence was determined entirely by the behavior of a burn wound over 72 hours. No evidence was examined. No witnesses were called or questioned. No arguments were presented by either side. God spoke through the blisters on your palm, and his word was final. The comfortable lie about ordeal is that it was rare and archaic. A primitive, Dark Ages superstition that proper medieval courts had long since left behind. Something from the barbaric centuries before civilization reasserted itself. The truth is that trial by ordeal was standard legal procedure across most of Western Europe for the better part of 500 years. It was not a folk practice that the authorities tolerated reluctantly. It was an official judicial mechanism endorsed, regulated, and administered by the most powerful institution in the medieval world. The church ran the ordeals. Priests blessed the instruments. The proceedings were conducted in sacred space, with formal liturgy, with the same solemnity and procedural seriousness brought to the sacraments themselves. The ordeal was not superstition tolerated by the system. It was the system. Trial by cold water operated on a different theological principle, but the same fundamental logic. The accused was bound hand and foot and lowered carefully into a body of water, usually a river or a pond or a specially prepared pit that had been blessed by a priest. The theological reasoning ran like this: water that had been consecrated, made holy through the blessing of the church, would accept an innocent person into itself, because purity recognized purity, but it would reject a guilty person, expelling the sinful body to the surface, because sacred water could not tolerate the presence of sin. If you sank, you were innocent. God's water had embraced you. If you floated, you were guilty. God's water had spat you out. Think about what this means in practical terms. Sinking, which in any other context would mean drowning, was the desired outcome. The innocent person went under and had to be hauled out quickly enough by attendants to prevent actual death. The guilty person bobbed on the surface and lived, which was the worst result, because living through the test meant you had been found guilty and punishment was coming. Every outcome put you at risk. Innocence could kill you if the attendants were too slow. Guilt saved your life momentarily, only to condemn it through the verdict that followed. The system was constructed so that there was no safe result, only a choice between two different kinds of danger. And the theological framework that justified this was built so that the more physically dangerous outcome was the one that proved you had nothing to fear. Trial by combat was the third major form. Two parties to a dispute, or their hired or appointed champions, fought each other in a supervised, formalized combat before witnesses and officials. The winner was presumed to have received God's favor. Victory was proof of righteousness. The logic was identical to the other ordeals in its theological foundation. Human judgment is unreliable. God's judgment is perfect. Put two men in a fight, and God will ensure the righteous one prevails, because God would not permit a just cause to be defeated by an unjust one. The system acknowledged, without visible discomfort, that a larger, stronger, better trained, better equipped man was overwhelmingly more likely to win. But this was folded neatly into the theological explanation. God chose to favor the righteous party by giving them the physical advantages necessary for victory. Size and strength were not unfair advantages. They were evidence of divine selection. Trial by combat was formally available in English law until 1819, when a defendant named Abraham Thornton actually invoked it, and Parliament, in a state of appalled surprise that the option still existed, hastily abolished it. And then there was compurgation, the oath-helping system. Instead of submitting to a physical ordeal, the accused gathered a specified number of oath helpers, people willing to swear a solemn, binding oath before God that the accused was telling the truth and was of good character. The number of oath helpers required varied by the nature and severity of the charge and the social standing of the accused. If you assembled the required number, and they all swore successfully, without stumbling over the formulaic words, which was believed to indicate divine disapproval, you were cleared. If you could not gather enough willing oath helpers, or if one of them faltered during the oath, you were presumed guilty. This system transformed your social network into your legal defense. Your innocence was not measured by evidence, but by how many people in your community were willing to stake their immortal souls on your character. A well-connected person with a large family, deep roots in the community, and strong relationships could assemble oath helpers readily. A newcomer, an outsider, a person with enemies, or someone whose social standing was already damaged, could not find enough people willing to take the risk. The system did not measure truth. It measured social capital, and it rewarded those who had it with acquittal, while punishing those who lacked it with conviction. All of these methods rested on a single theological premise that made them internally coherent, even if they strike the modern mind as bewildering. The premise was that God was an active, interested, continuously present participant in human justice. God saw every crime, God knew every heart, and God would not, could not, permit an innocent person to suffer an unjust verdict, delivered through a mechanism that explicitly invited his intervention. If you carried the hot iron and your hand healed, God had spoken. If you sank in blessed water, God had accepted you. If you won the combat, God had strengthened your arm. The ordeal was not understood as a gamble, or a test of endurance, or a coin flip dressed up in religious language. It was a prayer made physical, and the outcome was the literal voice of God rendered in burns, water, and steel. The system collapsed not because anyone looked at it and concluded it was unjust. It collapsed because the church pulled the administrative plug. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 prohibited clergy from participating in judicial ordeals, which removed the theological foundation the entire practice depended on. Without a priest to bless the iron, the water, or the field of combat, the ordeal lost its claim to divine authority. It became just a burn, just a drowning risk, just a fight, and without the assurance that God was speaking through the result, the outcome had no legal meaning. The ordeals did not end because someone invented a better idea of justice. They ended because of an administrative policy change at a church council, and the courts were left scrambling to find a replacement. What filled the gap was the jury trial, but the early jury bore almost no resemblance to what that term means today. Early jurors were not impartial strangers, selected for their ignorance of the case. They were local men, chosen specifically because they already knew the facts. They were your neighbors. They were expected to be familiar with the accused, familiar with the accusation, familiar with the circumstances, and prepared to deliver a verdict based on what they already knew about the situation from living in the same community. Impartiality was not a virtue in this system, it was an irrelevance. Familiarity was the point. The jury was the community's collective judgment given formal legal standing, and the community already had opinions. This meant that a jury verdict functioned, in practice, as a social reputation assessment conducted under oath. If the community had already decided you were guilty, the jury returned guilty. If the community liked you, if your family was respected, if you had powerful patrons or useful allies, the jury might find reason to acquit, regardless of what had actually happened. The evidence, in the modern sense of physical proof and sworn testimony, subjected to adversarial questioning, was not the central factor. The central factor was what 12 men who had known you for years thought about you before they sat down. The shift from ordeal to jury was not welcomed uniformly, and the reasons for reluctance are grimly understandable. Being judged by God, for all its physical terror, offered at least the comforting fiction of perfect, incorruptible justice. God could not be bribed. God did not hold grudges about the boundary dispute from 3 harvests ago. God was not competing with you for the same woman or the same strip of plowed field. Your neighbors were all of these things. A jury trial replaced divine judgment with human judgment, and human judgment came with all the baggage that humans carry. Your life was now in the hands of men who might owe you money, who might want your land, who might have heard a rumor about your wife, who might simply dislike the way you looked at them in church last Sunday. The ordeal was terrifying. The jury was personal, and in a small community, where everyone knew everyone else's business and grudges could simmer for decades, personal was sometimes worse. Think about all of this the next time you hear the phrase trial by a jury of your peers, and feel a warm glow of democratic principle. The concept was born here, in a room full of men who already knew what they believed, who were not required to explain their reasoning, who were not instructed on legal standards, and whose verdict could not be meaningfully appealed. The modern jury system evolved from this starting point, refined itself over centuries, added layers of procedural protection and rules of evidence and requirements of impartiality that the original model lacked entirely. But the seed was planted in this soil, in a world that had just lost its claim to divine judgment and needed something, anything, to fill the terrifying gap between accusation and verdict. And if the mechanism for deciding guilt already feels precarious, wait until you see what it costs to pass through the courts themselves, regardless of whether those courts found you guilty or innocent. Because the medieval justice system was not a public service provided for the benefit of the people it governed. It was a business, and you were about to discover exactly how much your justice was worth, measured out in coin. Justice, in this world, is not free. It is not even cheap. And the cruelest trick of the medieval legal system, the one that grinds hardest against everything a modern person believes about what courts are supposed to be, is that the cost of being dragged through it could destroy you more completely than the crime you were accused of ever could, even if the court ultimately decided you had done nothing wrong. You are about to learn what it costs to be innocent. The modern assumption is that a legal system exists to serve the people who live under it. Courts are funded by taxes. Judges are paid by the state. If you are accused of a crime, the system processes you at its own expense, because the community has a collective interest in justice being done and has agreed to bear the cost collectively. You may hire a lawyer, and that lawyer may cost you dearly, but the court itself, the building, the officials, the administrative machinery of investigation and judgment is a public service you have already paid for through the taxes you contribute. The court does not send you a bill for the privilege of being tried. That assumption is so deeply embedded in the modern mind that most people have never thought to question it. Medieval courts charged you for everything. From the moment an accusation was made against you, the financial extraction began, and it did not stop until the process was complete, whether that process ended in acquittal or conviction or somewhere in the long, expensive gray area between the two. Every step had a fee. Every official had a hand extended. Every stage of the procedure came with a cost that the accused was expected to bear personally, regardless of their guilt or innocence, regardless of their ability to pay, and regardless of whether they had any choice about being there in the first place. Start with the amercement. This was the standard financial penalty imposed by medieval courts for virtually everything, from the most trivial infractions to serious offenses, and its defining feature was that the amount was not fixed by any statute or schedule. It was assessed at the discretion of the court, the judge, the lord, the steward, whoever presided over the proceedings, set the fine based on what they believed the offender could afford to pay. In theory, this prevented fines from being ruinous. It was supposed to be merciful, calibrated to the individual's means, rather than imposed as a flat rate that might be trivial for a wealthy man and catastrophic for a poor one. In practice, it meant that the court had an incentive to estimate your wealth as generously as possible, because a higher estimate of your means justified a higher fine, and a higher fine meant more revenue flowing to the lord or the crown. A provision in Magna Carta required that amercements be proportional and should not destroy a man's livelihood or deprive him of the tools of his trade. But the definition of proportional was left to the people collecting the money, and the people collecting the money had a structural financial interest in the most expansive definition available. The amercement was not the only cost. Courts charged appearance fees. If you were summoned and appeared, you might owe a fee for the privilege of answering the summons. If you were summoned and failed to appear, You were fined for non-attendance, and the fine for failing to show up was frequently higher than the amercement you would have faced had you appeared and been convicted, which created a perfectly elegant trap: attend court and pay, skip court and pay more. Either way, the court collected. If the case was heard by a jury, the jury itself could be a cost. Jurors in some jurisdictions expected payment, or at least hospitality, from the parties to the case, and a defendant who could not provide it might find the jury less sympathetically disposed. If the case required multiple hearings, because the court's schedule was crowded or the matter was complex, each session carried its own fee. If the court adjourned and required you to return on a different day, the cost of that return, the lost working time, the travel, the attendance fee for the new session, fell on you. And then there was jail. If you were held in custody awaiting trial, the cost of your imprisonment was entirely your own responsibility. Medieval jails were not state-funded institutions staffed by salaried public employees. They were privately operated facilities where the gaoler, the man who held the keys and maintained the space, made his living directly from the people he held. You paid for your food. If you wanted to eat, you paid the gaoler for the meals he provided, or paid for food to be brought in from outside. You paid for bedding, if you wanted straw to sleep on rather than bare stone. You paid for candles, if you wanted any relief from the darkness of your cell. You paid for the removal of heavier shackles. Prisoners in medieval jails were typically chained, and the weight and restrictiveness of your chains could be adjusted, for a fee, from heavy irons that made movement agonizing to lighter restraints that allowed you to sit, stand, and sleep with something approaching comfort. The difference between bearable imprisonment and unbearable imprisonment was determined entirely by how much money you could pay the man who controlled every aspect of your captivity. A wealthy prisoner could purchase tolerable conditions. A poor prisoner received the conditions that poverty purchased, which were designed to be, and consistently were, as miserable as the gaoler's indifference and the building's decay could make them. The jail was not a holding facility provided by the community for the temporary containment of accused persons. It was a business. You were the revenue. And the gaoler's incentive was not to process you quickly and release you, but to keep you as long as the legal system required, and to extract as much money from your presence as your resources could bear. Consider the position of a presenting jury, the group of local men required by law to report all crimes and offenses that had occurred in their community since the last court session. If the presenting jury failed to report an offense that the court later discovered independently, the jurors themselves were fined for concealment. This created a remarkable incentive structure. The people responsible for reporting crimes were financially punished for not reporting enough of them, which meant that the system actively pressured the community's own members to generate the accusations that fed the court's revenue stream. Silence was not neutral. Silence was expensive, and the court's appetite for accusations was structurally insatiable, because every accusation that entered the system generated fees, and every fee flowed upward to the lord or the crown. Let me walk you through the full cost of a single accusation, step by step, and you can feel every coin leave your hand as the process grinds forward. You are accused. The accusation itself costs your accuser nothing, or nearly nothing, which is one reason accusations were easy to make and difficult to discourage. A neighbor with a grudge, a competitor with a motive, a former friend with a score to settle, could initiate a process that would cost you weeks of income and months of anxiety at no meaningful personal expense. You are summoned to court. You appear because failing to appear would cost you more. You stand before the court. The court charges for processing your case. If witnesses are called, the cost of securing their attendance may fall partly or wholly on you. If the court investigates further, sending officials to examine evidence or interview additional parties, the administrative cost is yours. If the case spans multiple sessions, each session carries its own attendance charge. If you are convicted, the amercement falls. This is the major blow. A fine of several shillings for a moderate offense, potentially several pounds for a serious one. Convert those figures into labor, and the scale becomes physical. A skilled craftsman earning 4 to 5 pence a day would need to work 10 to 12 full days to cover a 2-shilling immersement. A fine of £1, 240 pence, represents roughly 50 working days, nearly 2 entire months of labor, surrendered to the court for a single offense. And the immersement does not include the fees you have already paid to be processed through the system. The fine is the headline number. The fees are the hidden surcharge that nobody quotes until you are already standing in the court, watching your purse empty. If you are acquitted, you might assume the bleeding stops. It does not. You have already paid the appearance fees. You have already paid for your time in jail, if you were held. You have already lost the working days you spent in court instead of at your trade. Your family has already absorbed the economic shock of your absence. Innocence did not come with a refund. The system had taken its cut before the verdict was rendered, and it was not in the business of returning money to people it had finished processing. This is the sequential cost strip laid entirely bare. Every layer of the system extracts payment from the person passing through it. The accuser pays nothing or next to nothing. The court officers collect their administrative fees. The gaoler collects his daily charges. The lord collects the immersement. The crown takes its share of the profits from royal courts. And the accused, the single person at the center of the entire machinery, absorbs every cost at every stage, regardless of the verdict. The system was not designed to deliver justice and incidentally generate revenue as a side effect. It was designed to generate revenue and incidentally deliver justice as a byproduct. The distinction is critical because it explains almost every structural incentive embedded in the way medieval courts actually operated. Lords profited directly and substantially from their own courts. The manorial court was not merely a mechanism for maintaining order on the lord's estate. It was a revenue stream, and for many lords, a significant one. Immersements, fees, confiscated goods, and the various charges imposed on the community through the court all flowed directly to the lord's household. A busy court was a profitable court. A lord whose steward enforced regulations strictly, pursued violations energetically, and immersed offenders at the highest proportional level the community could bear, generated meaningful income from the judicial process alone. This created an institutional incentive structure that would horrify a modern legal theorist, but was considered entirely normal in this world. The person who made the rules was the same person who profited when the rules were broken. The person who decided what constituted an offense was the same person who received the fine for that offense. The Lord was simultaneously the lawmaker, the prosecutor, the judge, and the beneficiary of the judgment, and the system occupied all of these roles at once, with no visible sense that there might be a conflict of interest anywhere in the arrangement. The ecclesiastical courts added their own layer of financial extraction on top of everything the secular system was already taking. Church courts charged fees for every stage of their proceedings, just as secular courts did. And since the church claimed jurisdiction over an enormous range of human behavior, from heresy to adultery, to failure to pay tithes, to defaming your neighbor's moral character, the opportunities for the ecclesiastical system to process people through its fee-generating machinery were virtually limitless. A person accused of a moral offense in a church court faced the same grinding accumulation of costs, appearance fees, administrative charges, the expense of purgation or penance, with the added complication that the church had its own detention facilities and its own methods of compelling payment that operated independently of anything the secular lord could do. The two systems, secular and ecclesiastical, did not merely coexist. They competed. A lord who saw a lucrative offense, tried in a church court instead of his own, lost the immersement revenue that offense would have generated. The church jealously guarded its jurisdictional claims because those claims represented not just spiritual authority, but financial territory. Every case heard in a church court was a case that generated fees for the church rather than for the Lord, and every expansion of ecclesiastical jurisdiction was simultaneously an expansion of the church's revenue base at the expense of secular power. The jurisdictional conflicts you heard about earlier tonight, the ones that got Thomas Becket killed, were not abstract arguments about legal philosophy. They were fights over money. Who gets to process the accused? Who gets to charge the fees? Who gets to collect the fine? The theological language was genuine, but the economic stakes underneath it were what made the arguments worth killing over. Think about what this meant for a family. A husband and father convicted of a moderate offense, something serious enough to draw a substantial amercement, but not severe enough for physical punishment, could leave his household in financial ruin without ever setting foot inside a prison cell. The fine depleted whatever savings the family had managed to accumulate. The court fees depleted more. Lost working days during the trial cost more still. If the amercement could not be paid immediately and in full, it became a debt owed to the Lord, recorded in the court rolls, and subject to additional penalties with each passing court session at which it remained unpaid. The family might sell livestock to raise the amount. They might sell tools. They might borrow from a neighbor at whatever interest the neighbor demanded. If a neighbor was willing to lend to a family, the court had already flagged as debtors. Each sale, each loan, each depleted resource pushed the household closer to the edge. And in a world where a single bad harvest or a single sick draft animal could tip a family from precarious stability into genuine crisis, the margin for recovery was razor thin and getting thinner with every shilling that left the house. The concept of outlawry sat at the far extreme of the system's economic logic, the point where the revenue machine gave way to something more fundamental. To be declared an outlaw was to be placed entirely outside the protection of the law. An outlaw had no legal standing. They could not bring lawsuits. They could not own property. They could not enter into enforceable contracts. They could not testify. And most significantly, anyone could kill an outlaw without legal consequence, because a person outside the law had no legal existence, and killing a legal nonentity was not a crime. Outlawry was the system's final sanction, reserved primarily for people who fled from justice or who refused repeatedly to appear in court, and it represented the ultimate expression of the system's foundational philosophy. Legal protection was not an inherent right. It was a privilege granted in exchange for submission to the system's authority and its costs. If you refused to submit, if you would not stand before the court, pay the fees, and accept the judgment, you lost everything the law provided, including the right to go on living without anyone's permission. And beneath all of this, beneath the amercements and the court fees and the gaoler's charges and the jurisdictional competition between secular and ecclesiastical systems, lay a reality so fundamental that most people living inside it never thought to articulate it. The legal system was not something that existed alongside the economy. It was part of the economy. Courts were profit centers. Fines were revenue streams. Accusations were the raw inputs that fed the machine. And the people who passed through the system, guilty or innocent, convicted or acquitted, were the source material from which the entire operation extracted its wealth. Understanding this does not excuse the system or condemn the people who operated it. It simply explains why the system looked the way it did, why it behaved the way it behaved, and why reform was so difficult to achieve. You do not voluntarily dismantle a machine that is making you money, no matter how many people it grinds up in the process. And all of this operated in a world where the most common way to find yourself standing in front of a court in the first place was not through anything you did with your hands, but through something you did with your mouth. Because this world regulated speech with the same meticulous, punishing precision it brought to clothing, forest wood, and bread weights. And the consequences for saying the wrong thing could be as immediate, as public, and as destructive as any amercement the court could impose. The energy of the night shifts here. The detailed analytical architecture of courts and costs and legal mechanisms softens. The way a city quiets in the hours past midnight, and what comes into focus instead is something more human, more intimate, more personal. because the crimes of speech were not committed in courtrooms or forests or market squares. They were committed in kitchens and doorways and over fences between neighbors who had known each other for years. And the punishments were designed not to fill the Lord's treasury, but to silence. Speech crimes in medieval England fell into several overlapping categories, each with its own courts, its own procedures, and its own specific penalties. But the thread running through every one of them is that the offense was not defined by what you said. It was defined by the effect your words had on the social order and by how much power the person you spoke about had to make you regret speaking. Slander and defamation were serious legal matters, divided between secular and ecclesiastical courts in ways that reveal the system's deepest assumptions about speech. If you called someone a thief, a cheat, or a criminal in a way that damaged their commercial reputation, that was a secular offense, tried in the Lord's court or the borough court. If you called someone a heretic, a fornicator, a whore, or an adulterer, that was an ecclesiastical matter, because the defamation touched moral and sexual character, which the church claimed jurisdiction over. The line between the two was not about the severity of the insult. It was about which institution owned the category of reputation you had damaged. Your neighbor's commercial honor belonged to secular law. Your neighbor's sexual honor belonged to the church. And attacking either one without proof was a crime that could be prosecuted in the court that owned the relevant category of your neighbor's good name. The accusation of common scold was something different entirely, and it carried a specific, gendered weight that reveals the legal system's particular anxieties about women who spoke too much, too loudly, or with too much force. A common scold, in legal Latin communis rixatrix, was a person, almost invariably a woman, who was habitually quarrelsome, argumentative, or disruptive to the peace of her neighborhood through persistent and aggressive speech. The charge did not require that anything she said was false. It did not require that any specific individual had been harmed by a specific statement. It did not require any particular words at all. It required only that the accused was, in the judgment of the community and the court, too vocal, too confrontational, and too relentlessly present in the soundscape of her street for the comfort of the people who had to listen to her. The punishments for scolding were engineered for maximum public humiliation. The ducking stool was the most widely known. The convicted woman was strapped into a wooden chair mounted at the end of a long pivoting beam, paraded through the street to the nearest body of water, and publicly dunked, repeatedly, before an audience of her neighbors, who were expected to observe, to absorb the lesson, and in practice to be entertained. The number of immersions depended on the court's assessment of severity, and, one suspects, on the mood of the crowd. The experience was physically dangerous, publicly degrading, and explicitly designed to make a visible, memorable example of what happened to women whose voices were deemed excessive by a system administered entirely by men. The scold's bridle, also called the branks, was used in some communities as an alternative or supplement to the ducking stool. This was a metal framework fitted over the head and locked in place, with a flat plate of iron, sometimes studded with a small spike, that pressed against the tongue when the wearer attempted to speak. The device did not merely punish speech, it physically prevented it. In some recorded cases, the woman wearing the bridle was led through the town by a chain or a rope, displayed to her neighbors in an enforced public silence that was both the punishment and its own message. Your tongue caused the problem. This device has solved it. The visual language was as clear as any legal statute, and considerably more memorable. What makes these speech punishments revealing is not just their cruelty, which is striking, but their precision. They were not all-purpose penalties applied to miscellaneous offenders. They were tools designed specifically and exclusively for the crime of speaking too much, and they were applied with overwhelming, near-exclusive frequency to women. A man who was quarrelsome and disruptive in his neighborhood might face a fine or a bond to keep the peace. A A woman exhibiting the same behavior was subjected to physical devices engineered to shut her mouth. The legal system did not merely punish women for the content of their speech. It punished them for the act of speaking itself, when that speaking occurred in a volume, a frequency, or a register that the men who administered the courts found inconvenient. Seditious speech occupied the most dangerous territory of all, because it aimed your words directly at the people who had the greatest power and the strongest motivation to punish you for them. Criticizing the king was not just unwise, it was criminal. Spreading rumors about the king's health or the state of his marriage could be prosecuted. Questioning royal decisions, speculating publicly about the succession, discussing the possibility that the current monarch might die or be deposed, all of these fell under various statutory prohibitions, the most significant being scandalum magnatum within the Statute of Westminster of 1275. This provision made it an offense to spread false news or tales that could produce discord between the king and his nobles, or between the king and his people. The definition of false was determined, naturally, by the people the tales were about. If the king or his great lord said the news was false, the news was false, and the person who spread it was a criminal. The modern mirror here is so close, it is nearly a reflection rather than a comparison. The impulse to criminalize speech that threatens the powerful, to draw a legal line between legitimate expression and dangerous dissent, to use the machinery of law to silence words that embarrass or destabilize the people who hold authority, has not evolved in any fundamental structural way since these statutes were first enforced in the 13th century. The tools are different. The legal vocabulary is more sophisticated. The protections for speech are stronger in many modern systems, though not in all of them, and not consistently even in the ones that claim them. But the impulse itself, the deep institutional conviction that certain words are so threatening that they must be suppressed by force, remains unchanged in its essential character. Every government that has ever existed has drawn a line between speech it can tolerate and speech it cannot. And every government that has ever drawn that line has drawn it in the precise location where words begin to threaten the stability of the people holding power. And the vanity echo running through all of these speech crimes, from slander to scolding to sedition, is perhaps the most consistent thread in everything you have heard tonight. The human compulsion to punish other people for saying things you do not want to hear, while simultaneously defending your own absolute right to say whatever you please to whoever will listen, is not a medieval quirk or a modern innovation. It is a feature of the species itself. It appears in every century, every culture, every political system, and every level of social organization with a reliability that borders on the structural. We punish speech. We always have, and we always believe, with perfect and untroubled sincerity, that the speech we are punishing deserves punishment, while the speech we protect deserves protection. The medieval woman in the ducking stool and the modern person who loses a job over an unpopular opinion expressed online are separated by centuries of legal evolution and connected by the same immovable human instinct. Your words are dangerous. My words are freedom. The difference between the two has always been determined not by what was said, but by the power of the person it was said about. The night deepens around you now. The hard edges of courts and statutes and formal legal categories are blurring. The way objects in a room lose their sharpness as the light fades. But the law does not sleep just because you are beginning to, and the rules still waiting for you in the dark are perhaps the strangest of all, because in this world there were crimes that had nothing to do with what you did. They had nothing to do with what you said. They were crimes of being, crimes of existing in the wrong place, at the wrong hour, doing the wrong amount of nothing. And they were enforced with the same grinding, impersonal, quietly destructive efficiency as everything else you have walked through tonight. You are doing nothing wrong. You need to understand that first, because it matters. You are not stealing. You are not trespassing. You are not wearing forbidden fabric or selling underweight bread, or thinking heretical thoughts about the nature of communion. You are simply standing in the wrong place at the wrong time, or walking down a road without a clear enough destination, or sitting in your own doorway after the wrong bell has rung. And in this world, that is enough, because the laws waiting for you now do not care what you have done. They care what you are. Vagrancy laws are the quietest and in some ways the cruelest legislation in the medieval system. They did not target specific acts, they targeted a condition. The condition of being without fixed employment, without a recognized master, without a permanent slot in the social structure that would vouch for your usefulness and your right to exist where you were standing. A person who could not demonstrate that they belonged somewhere was not merely suspicious, they were criminal. Their unattached existence was the offense. The Statute of Laborers of 1351 is where this tightens into something genuinely suffocating. The Black Death had just killed somewhere between a third and half the population of England. The survivors found themselves with leverage for the first time in living memory. There were not enough workers. Wages were climbing. Laborers were leaving their home parishes to find employers willing to pay more. Parliament's response was breathtaking in its directness. It froze wages at pre-plague levels. It made it illegal to refuse work at the statutory rate. It made it illegal to leave your parish in search of better pay. It made it a crime to be unemployed if you were physically capable of working. If you are able-bodied and not already employed, you are legally required to accept any offer of work at the government-mandated wage. Refusing is a crime. Walking away is a crime. Simply existing without employment is a punishable offense. The law did not regulate labor. It conscripted it, and the people it conscripted were exclusively those with the least power to resist. The Statute of Cambridge in 1388 tightened the grip further, requiring laborers to carry letters of permission when traveling. An internal passport system for the working poor. If you were stopped on a road without documentation proving your lord or your community had authorized your journey, you were presumed to be a runaway and could be arrested, returned to your parish, and punished. The freedom to walk from one town to the next was not your right. It was a privilege belonging to the people above you, and they could revoke it at any time. The modern mirror here lands on the skin. Non-compete clauses that prevent workers from leaving for better-paying competitors. Wage-fixing scandals, where corporations secretly agree not to poach each other's employees. The ongoing political resistance to minimum wage increases in industries built on cheap labor. The tools differ, but the logic is identical. Labor is most useful to the people who buy it when labor has no choice. The most reliable way to ensure labor has no choice is to make the alternatives illegal. The sturdy beggar, the person physically capable of work but found begging or wandering, was a figure of intense legal anxiety. Someone who had slipped free of the system entirely. Not working for anyone, not paying rent to anyone, not producing value for anyone the system recognized. The punishment escalated with repetition. Stocks for a first offense, branding for a second. Repeat offenses could mean slavery or hanging. The crime was not what you had done. The crime was existing outside the system's ability to profit from you. The system also drew a hard line between the deserving poor, those too old or too sick to work, who were granted permission to beg, and the undeserving poor, those whose poverty was treated as a moral failure rather than a circumstance. The deserving poor received authorization to be poor. The undeserving poor were punished for it. And the line between the two was drawn exclusively by people who had never experienced either. Curfew added another layer. The word comes from the Norman French couvre feu, cover fire. The evening bell originally signaled that household fires should be banked to prevent the devastating blazes that could sweep through timber-frame towns in hours. But the curfew quickly became a social boundary. After the bell, you were expected to be indoors. Being out without good reason was criminal in many jurisdictions. The watch patrolled the streets, looking for exactly the kind of person who had no business being outside at that hour. A wealthy merchant walking home late was unlikely to be stopped. A stranger, a laborer, a young person without an obvious destination was exactly who the curfew was designed to catch. Neutral in its language, selective in its enforcement, a pattern you have seen so many times tonight, it has probably stopped surprising you. Games were regulated with specificity that seems petty until you understand the logic. Edward II banned football in 1314. Edward III banned it again. Richard II banned it again. Henry IV banned it again. The repeated bans tell the same story as the repeated sumptuary laws. Nobody obeyed, but the rationale was military pragmatism. The government wanted working men practicing archery, which was useful in war, not chasing a ball through the streets, which was not. Gambling was similarly restricted, though primarily for the lower classes. Games of chance among the wealthy were tolerated. Games of chance among laborers were criminal, because they wasted time that should be spent working, and because the sight of poor people enjoying themselves in unauthorized ways made the authorities uncomfortable. Leisure was a privilege assigned by rank. The hue and cry system conscripted the entire community into policing. When a crime was committed and the perpetrator fled, every person within earshot was legally required to join the pursuit. Not encouraged, required. Failure to chase was a finable offense. You could be feeding your animals and hear a shout from the next street, and if you did not immediately run toward the sound, you were breaking the law. The system demanded not just obedience, but active participation. Standing by was itself a crime. The picture from all of these regulations is one of total social control. No sphere of life was considered private. No activity was too minor for regulation. No hour of the day was beyond the reach of some authority with the power to fine you. The system did not merely define crimes. It defined acceptable existence, and it punished any form of existence that fell outside the boundaries it had drawn. And yet, for all the grinding seriousness of everything you have walked through tonight, the law had room for one category of defendant so unexpected it softens the mood simply by existing. The animals. A pig is standing in a courtroom. This is not a metaphor. This is a documented, procedurally formal event that happened repeatedly across medieval Europe from the 13th century into the 17th, and the people who conducted these trials did not find them absurd at all. Secular courts tried individual animals, most commonly pigs, for acts of violence, usually injuries or deaths of young children. Ecclesiastical courts tried groups of animals, insects and rodents and pests, for the collective destruction of crops. Both followed proper legal procedure. Charges were read. Defense counsel was appointed. Witnesses were called. Verdicts were delivered. Sentences were carried out with the same public solemnity applied to human defendants. The sow of Falaise in 1386 had killed a child. It was arrested, imprisoned, tried before a court, convicted, and sentenced to be mutilated and hanged in the public square. The executioner received the same fee as for a human execution. The pig was dressed in a waistcoat and gloves. The total cost of the proceedings exceeded what it would have taken to feed a laboring family for a month. This was not theater. This was an expensive, procedurally meticulous event the community chose to invest in. The lawyer Bartholomew Chassigny, defending rats in the town of Autun in the early 1500s, argued his clients could not attend court because the journey was too dangerous, the route being infested with cats. The court accepted the argument and granted a continuance. With perfect procedural seriousness, the medieval legal system accepted that the rats had a legitimate excuse for not showing up. There was also a practical dimension beneath the theology. An animal trial assigned responsibility and resolved liability in a community where the question of fault was genuinely complicated. If a pig killed a child, was the owner liable? Were the parents negligent? Was the community at fault for allowing pigs to roam freely? The trial by placing the pig itself in the role of defendant, sidestepped these painful human questions. The pig was guilty. The pig was punished. The matter was closed without forcing anyone to accuse a grieving family of carelessness or demand compensation from a neighbor whose animal had caused an unthinkable tragedy. The trial was a mechanism for managing grief and blame in a community that could not afford the fractures a human accusation might produce. The Rooster of Basel, in 1474, deserves a mention simply for being the strangest case on record. The rooster was tried and convicted for laying an egg, an act considered unnatural and potentially diabolical, since folklore held that a cockerel's egg could hatch a basilisk. It was burned at the stake, along with the egg. A rooster, formally executed for laying an egg by a court that spent real money on the proceedings and took them with complete seriousness. The case is funny. It cannot not be funny. But it is also a window into a world where the boundaries of law were not drawn by rational analysis, but by a moral vision in which everything, every creature, every anomaly had meaning and required a formal response. The modern instinct is to laugh at all of this, but the laughter misses something important. These trials expressed a coherent worldview in which all creation was subject to God's moral order and therefore to the legal systems enforcing it. A pig that killed a child had transgressed the divine order, and the community was obligated to respond through formal legal channels. Simply killing the pig privately would have resolved the practical problem, but not the moral one. The trial transformed vengeance into justice, chaos into order. The form mattered because the form was what connected the community's response to the divine framework that gave all law its authority. The modern mirror is closer than you might expect. Corporate personhood, the legal fiction allowing a corporation to hold rights and face lawsuits as if it were a person, is not structurally different from the medieval fiction that treated a pig as a moral agent. Environmental lawsuits filed on behalf of rivers and ecosystems extend legal standing to non-human entities in ways a medieval court would have grasped immediately. The impulse to bring the non-human world inside the boundaries of law is not a curiosity from a distant age. It is an ongoing feature of legal systems still deciding where the line of personhood falls. The night is very deep now. The laws are quieter here, not because they are gentler, but because the energy has settled into something slower, something that breathes with the rhythm of a body that has been lying still for a long time. The animals have had their trial. The marketplace has closed. The curfew bell has rung. And the system, that vast tangle of rules and courts and fees that you have been walking through for hours, still has a few things left to show you. But the things that remain are darker and quieter, and they touch the parts of this world where the consequences followed you, and your children, and your children's children, long after the courtroom doors had closed. Treason was the widest net the law could throw, and its reach would stun you. The Treason Act of 1351 defined high treason as crimes against the crown, and petty treason as crimes against your immediate superior. A wife who killed her husband was guilty of petty treason. A servant who killed his master was guilty of petty treason. The hierarchy of loyalty ran upward only. Betraying your superior was the worst category of crime the system recognized. Your superior harming you was discipline. The punishment for high treason was designed to be unforgettable: hanging, drawing, and quartering for men, burning at the stake for women. These were public spectacles, choreographed performances of state power staged before crowds who were expected to watch and absorb the lesson. But the real danger of treason law was not its punishments. It was its flexibility. Imagining the king's death was treason. Clipping coins was treason, because the king's image on the coin made defacing it an attack on the king himself. The category expanded and contracted with political need, which meant that treason was less a fixed crime than a tool, available whenever the crown needed to destroy someone and wanted a charge that carried the maximum possible consequence. And the destruction did not stop with the convicted person. Attainder, the legal consequence of a treason conviction, stripped the traitor's entire family of their lands, their titles, and their legal standing. A single conviction could erase a family from the records within a generation. The father hanged, the lands seized, the children left with nothing, not even the name that had once meant something. The quiet ruin was total, but the system that could destroy you so completely was also riddled with exits, if you knew where to find them and had the resources to reach them. Church sanctuary allowed a person who reached a church and touched the door to claim protection for up to 40 days. Benefit of clergy, which you encountered earlier tonight, let anyone who could recite the neck verse escape secular punishment entirely. Pardons could be purchased. Abjuration of the realm, swearing to leave England forever and walk barefoot to the nearest port, was available as an alternative to trial. The status flip is sharp and by now familiar. Every one of these escape routes favored the literate, the connected, and the wealthy. The same system that could hang a peasant for picking up sticks offered a nobleman multiple procedural exits from charges far more serious. A literate merchant could claim benefit of clergy. A wealthy lord could purchase a pardon. A connected family could negotiate terms. Justice was not blind. It had excellent vision, and it used that vision to sort people by rank before deciding what they deserved. Women were excluded from benefit of clergy until 1624, which meant that for centuries, one of the few reliable escape routes from the death penalty was closed to half the population by default. The loopholes were real. Access to them was the privilege. The modern mirror barely needs stating. Bail systems that favor the wealthy. The quality gap between public defenders and private attorneys. Plea bargaining structures that pressure the poor into guilty pleas while the resourced negotiate. The structural reality that escape routes from legal systems are distributed by class has not changed in any way that matters. The architecture is identical, the materials are different, and beneath all of this, beneath the dramatic executions and the sanctuary claims and the purchased pardons, lay the most common form of destruction the legal system produced, and it was not dramatic at all. It was quiet, it was slow, and it happened to families who never appeared in any chronicle or any history book, because the system erased them too thoroughly for anyone to remember they had existed. A fine you cannot pay becomes a debt. A debt becomes a lien on your land. The loss of land becomes the loss of status. The loss of status becomes vulnerability to further legal action. Your children inherit your debts and your diminished standing. Within a generation, a family that was stable, productive, and rooted in its community simply disappears from the records. The manor court rolls tell the story in the most understated way possible. A name appears, it appears again, with a fine attached. It appears again, with a larger fine. It appears with a note about unpaid debts. And then it stops appearing. The name is gone. The family is gone. Not executed, not banished. Just slowly, methodically ground down by a system that extracted a little more each time until there was nothing left to extract, and then moved on to the next name in the ledger. For every dramatic execution the title of tonight's video promises, there were dozens of these quiet destructions. Families that broke not with a single catastrophic blow, but with the steady, patient pressure of a system that was designed, at every level, to take more than it gave. The title says, executed for almost nothing, and that happened. But the more common fate was something less visible, and in some ways, more cruel. Ruined for almost nothing, erased for almost nothing, forgotten for almost nothing. So tonight, as you settle deeper into your bed, with its clean sheets, and its soft pillow, and its remarkable, historically unprecedented comfort, spare a quiet thought for them. Not the kings and the bishops and the lords who built the system and profited from it, the other ones. The baker who lost his oven over a loaf that weighed an ounce too little. The woman in the ducking stool whose crime was speaking too loudly in her own street. The family in the forest who needed firewood and learned that the sticks on the ground belonged to someone who would never be cold. The man who wore a nicer coat than the law said he deserved and paid for the vanity, with public shame. They were not simpler than you. They were not less intelligent or less aware of the absurdity pressing down on them. They navigated a system that could destroy them for almost nothing, and they found ways, stubborn and resourceful and deeply human ways, to live inside it anyway, to raise children, to tell jokes, to love the people next to them, to get through the day and start another one. They deserve to be remembered gently, and you deserve to rest. Breathe slow, let the old laws fade, let the courtrooms empty, and the curfew bells go quiet, and the forest settle into darkness. The past is never as simple as the stories make it, and it is never as far away as you think, but it is behind you now, and the night, at last, is yours.